So thank you, panelists, for being here to talk about what I'll kind of briefly describe as subsidiarity. Walking around the neighborhood, and I think Vince just alluded to it, it was a lot of hands have gone into the building of this place, and a lot of people have made a lot of decisions on their own, autonomously, collectively working together. I think we talk about, I love the analogy that Chuck shared about smell and beauty, and it made me think of something. My wife is from coastal North Carolina, and it's popular here as well. I think about dancing a lot. The Carolina Shag. Do we have any shaggers in the audience? Okay, good. That's it, really? That's all we got? Okay, good. Okay, later. But I think a lot about building a place is really a lot like dancing. And I think architecture, design, these things are a lot like dancing. We have this general idea, two people, maybe many people in a dance room, of how it works. But everybody has their own style. But generally, when two people kind of know together, they're on the same page about how it's going to work, then you can really do it beautifully. And that's a lot of what happened here. There was a lot of emergent order with people getting on the same page about what we wanted to do generally, and then everybody kind of running with it. This event has been a little bit like that. We have had a general idea of the topics we've wanted to discuss. We've put them out there, and we've given enormous latitude and autonomy and entirely, like almost no embarrassing little direction and support to all the panelists that have been here and our provocateurs. So thank you to everyone who's sort of pulled it together and been a part of it. With regard to this discussion, I have invited everybody, if they would like to, and a number of you have some prepared comments to share on the topic of subsidiarity. Then I think what will happen is that will seed a lot of questions and discussion from all of you. I have a couple questions that I'd like to get in if there's time for me to ask our panelists, and then we're going to go for there. And I am going to be very disciplined about a hard stop, so we're going to go to no later than 5 o'clock because we're in the low country and 5 o'clock is happy hour. Oh, okay. So if I may, I'd actually probably like all of you to talk, at least just to introduce yourselves. We have probably go ahead and introduce yourselves, and I think some of you have some prepared comments to share. Andreas, do you want to kick us off?
How long do we have?
5 to 10 minutes. Yeah.
Andres Tuani, town planner. No. Right, Andres Tuani, town planner. I was involved in the beginning, the design charrette for ION 25 years ago. And it's one of these things that it's one of the projects we've been involved with that has just come out better beyond expectations. And that's a whole story as to why some of them don't, come out as well as designed. But I would like to stick to the topic of subsidiarity and also beauty. The way I was taught what subsidiarity was that decisions should be made at the most local level that can competently make it. The most local level, the smallest level. In some ways, the United States is set up that way. In fact, in many ways, certain decisions are made at the federal level, and then the state level, and then the regional level, and the municipal level. And at some point, then there's a leap to the House where you can make decisions at the level of your household. So there's subsidiarity built in. And I would like to bring up the thought that there are many missing levels of subsidiarity between the household and the municipality. And it came clear to me when, during COVID, Liz and I have an empty lot in Coral Gables. And in those days, we really didn't want to go indoors for anything. And we wanted to just get the Miccosukee Indians to come and build a shack on our empty lot that the neighbors could come in and meet outdoors. And actually could be loaned to children taking lessons 6 or 7 neighborhood children to get their, basically hire a school teacher to teach them. And we had to go to City Hall to get permission to build a temporary shack. And we had to, because it set precedent, we essentially had to convince 78,000 other households to build a shack. There was nothing between the decision-making Liz and I made about the house and the city. And yet there was a 4-block area that was completely willing to do this, thought it was a great idea. And what we needed was levels at the level of maybe the block frontage. We needed a level of decision-making at the 4-block area and perhaps at the neighborhood level before we went to the whole of Coral Gables, right? And what was interesting about that, I realized that subsidiarity is an abstract principle, but in urbanism, it works much, much better when it's related intimately to a physical increment. That it actually, you really do have to say, this block face, which is 2 sides of the block, or these 4 blocks, or the inner block, are actually physically the increments of subsidiarity. It's not just an abstraction. And now the communities we design are very closely related with the thought of subsidiarity. We know that each element of increment of development should have its level of governance. Now, not every decision, as you know, the federal government makes decisions about diplomacy and military and so forth. Not every decision is made. But when asked at what level of subsidiarity should schools be decided? What schools teach, or at what level should a school be located? That decision being made. And that really profoundly needs to be cleared up. And the reason is that it has to do with human happiness, which I'd like to propose is equated to beauty. Okay, I'd like to make that connection. And that connection came from Leo Creer at one point. Leo Creer, who's all of our master, the master of us all, at once, and he was very anxious about reforming the world. And it was not going well, reforming the world. It was like he was frustrated. And at one point, he was happy. And I said, well, what happened, Leo? And he said, I have actually determined my circle of happiness. And I operate within my circle of happiness, which is I've defined my circle of subsidiarity. And anything that doesn't make me happy is outside that circle. You're fine. You can be suburbia over there, but I'm going to live in a beautiful town in Spain, okay, which makes me happy. And that circle of happiness has a lot to do with beauty, I think. Has a lot to do with beauty. And Chris Alexander, who was another one of these great, Jane Jacobs, Chris Alexander, Leo Creer, he came to Seaside and entered a building. And he didn't like, he said, no, I don't like it. And I says, well, Leo, I told him, Chris, you don't know anything about this building, why it's this way. It's actually designed for Southern brides. This is what they want, Southern brides. And he said, and I said, how do you decide you don't like it? And he said, well, he made this gesture. He said, whenever I enter a place, the first cut that I make, right, in thinking about it, is I ask myself, what?
I can
Hold it. He said, I walk into a building, and before I apply any of my intellect, I say, does this raise my spirits, or does this lower my spirit? Just like that, raise or open. It's an instant thing. And then he goes on to think about it as to why it was. And I was thinking about one of the most shocking things as I work in the Caribbean. They have this beautiful English colonial architecture. By the way, the English were really good, in the colonies. English colonial architecture. And what people are building are these concrete boxes. Really hideous. Low-ceilinged, flat-roofed, horribly proportioned windows. And they say, yeah, man, I like this, makes me happy. And he was happy because it was safer for hurricanes. The British buildings were eventually blown down, and the concrete bunkers were not. And he found his beauty was the safety of that building, and that's what made him happy. And I think we need to ask people what it is that makes them happy or makes their life beautiful. What makes your life beautiful? Because I think we're thinking too much about aesthetics. And one process, I'd just like to say this very quickly, one process that we use is we sit with a group like this, and we say, what are the most important things that would make your life happy, your life better? At any order, and you just take notes. You know, I would like to feel that I can go out at night. I would like to, whatever, you know, I would like my children to go to a good school, etc. And we just make the list for a whole day. Anything else you'd like to order up from the restaurant here, the restaurant at Rubenism? What else would you like us to place? So we make the list, then we put it in grammatically coherent order. And then the next day, we say, what is the most, the least important? Which really makes them think. What is the most important? What is the single most important thing? What is the second most important thing? That's the most challenging, because anybody can make a list when you have an infinite capacity. And so we eventually hammer out the list of most important, the least important. And then the third day we say, where is the line above which it is going to be mandatory, and which is the line below which is going to be recommended? You see? And once you have that, you can begin writing a code and designing a place that actually makes people happy. However, that happiness is only at the level of essentially the block face. Okay? So one last anecdote, I worked in a town just north of Orlando, which was actually a pretty little town that was getting decrepit. And they said, you've got to fix it. You know, this is getting decrepit. The shutters are coming down, it's not being painted. And we wrote a nice little code about how you have to fix your gutter and paint your shutters. And some people were very happy with it, and other people were not happy with it. They said, no, that's going to cost a lot, and we don't care. So we basically wrote the two codes, high, medium, and low maintenance, and said, okay, you decide which is this that you want per block face, because that's what you're looking at. You're looking at the block face. So what is going to make you happy? And we laid it on them. You decide, get back to us. We're fine with all three. And actually, everybody wanted the highest level of maintenance. But they were happy because we really did ask them. So I think that happiness, that beauty is, was this mentioned before, that actually beauty is correlated with happiness, you know, and a happy life as self-defined. And I think we're perfectly capable of that. With urbanism, we have all the tools.
Thank you.
I'll go blind.
The sunlight makes you happy, but not him. No, unhappy.
Shall I go? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'll just put my paper down. My name is Donald Livingston. I am a retired philosophy from Emory University. In other words, a recovering academic. I've written on David Hume and history of philosophy. I've spent some time as a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Edinburgh, and independent study fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I do philosophy of law and very much interested in the topic of this conference. The beauty we would like to see restored in contemporary architecture and cities owes much to the classical civilization of ancient Greece. Its guiding principle was that the size of buildings, cities, and government itself should be at a human scale. They built a unique and brilliant civilization composed of around 1,500 small republics, Athens being one of the largest with 300,000 people. So you can't say it can't be done. Medieval Christian Europe was a mosaic of thousands of independent political authorities. As late as 1700, Germany was composed of over 200 countries. But about this time, 17th century, the modern state appeared. And it became a virtual self-centralizing machine that sucked political life out of the independent social authorities left over from the Middle Ages, crushing them into ever larger centralized states. Hobbes called the state that artificial man, with an artificial limbs, artificial heart, and an artificial soul. It was this that led to resistance for centuries. The Swiss cantons, the Dutch provinces, the American colonies all seceded in the name of classical republicanism. The size of America, however, was that of a continent. So Republican life seemed impossible. Yet the population, at less than 4 million, was so scattered that the largest city in 1776 was Philadelphia, with only 30,000 people. New York did not reach the size of ancient Athens until about 1830. Jefferson aggravated the problem of size with the Louisiana Purchase that doubled the territory and prompted a secession movement in New England by New England Federalists, fearful that Virginia sought to become, quote, the Austria of America, end quote. Jefferson replied that America is indeed to build an empire, but it is to be what he called, quote, an empire of liberty, end quote, not a centralized empire in the European model. Should the Union grow too large in population and territory, states could simply secede, divide, or they could secede and divide themselves or secede from the Union and work out a just separation. State secession was widely accepted in antebellum America. We've forgotten that. And included Federalist leaders such as Gouverneur Morris of New York and John Quincy Adams. Virginia in the Revolution had conquered the vast Northwest Territory of Britain, containing today 5 states. But so salient was the matter of size that the territory was ceded to the Union on the ground that Virginia could not be a republic and control such territory. They gave it up. And Virginia was further divided by allowing its western counties to secede and become Kentucky. But Jefferson thought it was still too large. And he's proposed dividing the state into small sovereign republics, not counties, but sovereign republics, similar to the cantons of Switzerland. But this empire of liberty that he conceived of, which sought to make America safe for human-scale republicanism by secession and division, was overthrown by the centralizing effect of the Civil War, which not only pulled the teeth of state sovereignty in both North and South, it also destroyed the medieval sovereignty enjoyed in towns and cities prior to the war. The county of Mecklenburg in North Carolina, for instance, declared its independence from Britain in May of 1775, a year before the Declaration. New England towns claimed sovereign powers and nullified Jefferson's embargoes and Madison's War of 1812. They simply wouldn't participate. This sovereignty of cities was rooted in the ancient notion of the city as a person with agency. Johannes Althusius, a 17th century German political thinker, for example, said, quote, "The city is not considered dead as long as one person is left," end quote. The city is embodied in the person of the man. And Christians in the East said that Constantinople gave birth to children through the instrument of their parents. Antebellum Americans inherited something of this view and consider the city as a person with agency. A city, for instance, could be both a government and a business corporation. But that changed when post-Civil War progressive judges ruled that business corporations are persons with due process rights and equal protection of the laws, just as any individual person is, but a city corporation is not. In Hunter v. City of Pittsburgh, 1907, this change was stated by the Supreme Court in no uncertain terms. Quote, the state, this means the American states, not the federal government, the state, at its pleasure, may modify or withdraw all city properties, may take without compensation city property, repeal the charter and destroy the corporation. All this may be done without the consent of the citizens or even against their protest. In all these respects, the state is supreme. Urban scholar Robert Nelson remarks that this legal transformation, and it was a great transformation, was one of the centralizing trophies of the Civil War. Quote, any element of genuine sovereignty among such small territorial units as municipalities might be seen as another form of secession from the national community. Sovereign municipalities would stand in the way of modern and progressive trends, rebuke the ideals of Abraham Lincoln, and a triumph for the heirs of Jefferson Davis, end quote. But there was also a theological motive that Nelson brings out. For the modern state at that time, and to some extent today, was viewed religiously as the instrument of human progress. And the business corporation was its driving engine. So there was a theological motive here, human salvation. The state is the instrument of human salvation. Hegel said it's that veritable God on earth. A number of small independent towns retarded large-scale economic development and were a threat to human progress. So large cities were given power by the state to annex territory. Instead of a number of small sovereign towns evolving in an area, there would be one constantly expanding monster city with its urban sprawl, crime, corruption, crony capitalism, and all the rest. But the spirit of Republican liberty that animated the ancient Greeks to build an entire civilization at a human scale is not easily destroyed. Consider two practices that point to a revival in human scale republicanism. Now these are possible seeds, don't want to make too much of them, but I think we need to think about them. First, Florida authorized building a medieval-style republic that would be both a government and a business corporation. It commanded an area of 43 square miles and had authority to set, larger than Manhattan, and had authority to set its own building and zoning codes, build electric and nuclear power plants, create its own police and fire departments, manage water and sewage. It could tax and sell bonds for internal improvements, produce liquor and license its distribution, and more. The name of this medieval republic is Disney World. I'm giving you the structure. There's no Black Death in it or anything, but it receives 58 million visitors a year and has flourished for 50 years until this year, when after a bitter controversy, Florida rescinded the charter. Nevertheless, the idea of a medieval-style republic within a state has proven its worth. The governor of Colorado said he would welcome Disney World into his state and with the same privileges. The second kind of polity is not dependent on a state charter. It is a small republic based on private property covenants. They are best known as homeowners associations. They suddenly appeared out of nowhere through market forces after World War II. By 1970, they numbered around 10,000. By 2019, they were around 350,000, containing around 70 million people. Estimates are they're expected to grow to 50% by 2040. Most are small, but some are the size of cities. One of the oldest is Western Virginia, with a population of around 60,000. That's about the size of Florence, Renaissance Florence. It began in the 1960s, inspired in part by Leonardo da Vinci's plan for a circle of self-contained satellite cities of 30,000 to ring Milan. And as you know, Florida contains a number of these property-based towns. Now, some civil rights that we have end with the property line. You lose freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press when you are in a church or synagogue. The Amish community, for example, in Pennsylvania, is recognized as a Protestant republic with a population of 30,000 people and has received special privileges from state government. The Catholic town of Ave Maria, Florida, is another property-based town. It has 33,000 residents. It's centered around Ave Maria University. Is intentionally Catholic, but is also pro-business and welcomes people of other faiths. It intends to grow as a sustainable town and become a center of learning and culture. Now, should this happen, and the city grow, let's say, to 100 or 300,000, the latter the size of Athens, and should such property-based cities catch on and become things to emulate, as this little community is, and suppose they came to a number around 1,000 throughout the United States, which is a continent, we would have the faint lineaments of Greek civilization, a string of small independent republics. But in this case, they would be embedded in a monster modern state. The question is, how far can these property-based cities go in being radical centers of political life and standards for emulation? Well, I will close with a statement from Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek. Quote, "We shall not rebuild civilization on the large scale. It is no accident that on the whole, there was more beauty and decency to be found in the life of the small peoples, and that among the large ones, there was more happiness and contentment in proportion as they had avoided the deadly blight of centralization." Thanks.
Now, I've got a pretty loud voice. Do you want the microphone? Pretenses. I don't know anything about this.
I need to interrupt, but let's turn it on.
Oh, I thought I did. I'm here under false pretenses. I don't know much about city planning or urban design. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an architect. I'm a classical philologist by training with a specialty in ancient Greece, but I've spent my life as a journalist, editor, and general pontificator on political ethics. We're told to be radical today, and since I have 8 or 10 minutes, There's no time for nuance, so I'm going to overstate my argument grotesquely. And then you can take me to task for it. We live in an empire. We don't live in a republic. And this American empire has been a failure. And worse, it has devastated the moral, social, and artistic life of its subjects. Now, there are a number of alternative models. I want to talk about an alternative model that my friend Donald has just been talking about. The Greek polis, generally translated as city-state, but it means a great deal more than that. The Greek polis was the central social and political fact of Greek civilization. Ancient Greece was dotted with hundreds, thousands of polis, or city-states. When Aristotle famously defined mankind as a zoon politikon, a political animal, he was not suggesting that we're like Lyndon Johnson or Mitch McConnell, beasts who seek power over others by manipulating elections, but that we were organic beings who live together in organized societies that have evolved from family, kindreds, and villages. The so-called city-state has always been the political form in which and through which the heights of human achievement have been reached. And nation-states and empires, by contrast, rather than being evolutionary pinnacles, are actually phases of decadence and decline, both for the subjects and slaves who are exploited and robbed of their initiative, but also for the culture as a whole. We live in a very sterile culture. We don't recognize it because we're used to it. Contrast the creativity of the Sumerian and Akkadian cities of the 3rd millennium BC, in which the first breakthroughs in every known art were made, with the comparative stagnation of the Babylonian and Assyrian empires that were content to live off the earlier accomplishments and used Sumerian and Akkadian language and literature as their classics. The revival of European civilization that began in the later Middle Ages was largely the work of independent little towns, especially in Italy, Pisa and Siena, Genoa, and Florence. Among their other gifts was the rebirth of art and music we now call the Renaissance. The most stunning case, though, is the history of the archaic and classical Greeks, the most creative period in human history, a time when literary and artistic high points were reached that have never been reached again, when the foundations of art and literature, science, and philosophy were laid. This is the gift of a city-state. Now, most Greek cities were started on defensible hilltops where rulers built their palaces way back in the Bronze Age. But as the city spread down the slope and into the plain, the hilltop, the Acropolis, became a sacred place where the palaces were replaced by temples. They were inhabited by gods, not by men. Down there in the plain, they built their marketplaces like the Athenian Agora, where people gathered to buy and sell, to compete for honor and wealth, and exercise their civic duties. One of the Persian kings once said, "I don't respect any people who have a separate place set aside where they lie to each other." This agora was a competition for money, for power, and for honor. But on the Acropolis, they celebrated their unity as a people by building beautiful temples to their gods. In essence, the layout of a Greek city expressed topographically the tension between the force of love and friendship that united them in their families and their religion, and this is symbolized by the temples on the Acropolis, and the forces of competition and strife down in the dirty everyday life of the Agora. The layout of these Greek cities, of Athens and Agrigento and Syracuse, all across not just what we think of as Greece, but in Asia Minor, that is Turkey and the islands, but also Sicily and southern Italy. The layout of these cities seems to echo the teaching of the great poet-philosopher of Agrigento, Empedocles, who described our world as dominated by the contrasting forces of love and strife, or competition, or even hate. Under the compelling power of friendship or love, unlike and opposite elements are attracted together as they are in marriage, or the sexual union of male and female. While under the power of strife or competition, like withdraws to like and repels what is different, seeks its own, it seeks profit and power. Now, modern cities and states and nations and empires all exhibit these contrasting sets of institutions which the Greeks recognized. The family and extended networks of kinfolks are the basis of community, regardless of our personal merits or failings. We belong there. It's home, the place where Robert Frost says, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. A similar spirit is at the core of our churches and fraternal organizations, while the spirit of competition is exemplified in the marketplace, on Wall Street, competitive sports teams, and the force of strife and anger that set teams of men to kill each other in deadly combat, as they are now doing in Eastern Europe. The ancient Greek polis, or the Italian city-state, held these forces of love and strife in creative tension. Political and economic competition, even war between these cities, was common, but they also competed for excellence in athletics and art at the Olympic and Pythian Games. For example, they had competitions for choral music, tragedy, and comedy. Everything the Greeks did was in competition. A similar spirit of rivalry was in the pursuit of beauty inspired Italian cities of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. When the people of Siena heard that the Florentines were building a much bigger cathedral than they'd had before, nothing would stop Siena, a much smaller, much less rich town, from rising to the challenge and trying to build this monstrously huge cathedral. Now, I've been speaking of these cities as if they were unified or uniform social and political entities. The truth is that both Greek and Italian cities were far from unified. The various neighborhoods and kin groups within Athens had almost as much autonomy as an American state had in 1860. So Athens, with a population of 300,000 perhaps, was divided, neighborhood by neighborhood, rural village by rural village. These little small territories were called demes. Now, their people were supposed to support each other in legal battles and trials, and they tended to vote for their hometown boy in election. They were also places of beauty, with their own temples and colonnades where people sang and danced and celebrated their religion. If you want to look at it, there's a beautiful ode, and Sophocles was a very old man, and he writes to Oedipus at Colonus, and he pays tribute to his own little rural deme as being one of the most beautiful spots on earth. Edmund Burke once told us, to make us love our country must be lovely. And for the Greeks, that loveliness did not begin at some international level. It began in the home and in the neighborhood. And here we have the true spirit of the ancient Greek. He loved his family and his kinsfolk. He loved his neighborhood and his city. And he made them places of beauty that gladdened the heart with fine temples, joyous festivals, and beautiful music and poetry. Unfortunately, the beauty of these villages and neighborhoods has been swallowed up by the urban sprawl of metropolitan Athens that now holds half the population of Greece. And the natural beauties of these rural demes and splendid rural villas and glorious temples have been displaced by factories and squalid neighborhoods under the justification of progress. The Greeks were not alone in their love of neighborhoods and villages. Most Italian cities were composed of formerly divided neighborhoods. The Sienese contrade, as they were called, were neighborhoods. They were very competitive with each other. In early times, they used to play this neighborhood game of sticks and stones, and they would beat each other's brains out till the death toll finally got so high, they decided to turn it into a horse race, which they still hold. It's one of the biggest tourist attractions in Europe, the Palio delle Contrade, these horse races. My daughter lived in Siena for a year, and she said that the family she lived with, the father came from the contrada they were living in, and he's always saying, well, we're going to win because we're the best. And as soon as he left the house, the mother, who came from a different neighborhood, would explain her neighborhood was really much better. So just as there were competition for every sort of excellence and beauty between cities, a similar competitive spirit pitted neighborhood against neighborhood. And yet, Greek cities like Athens and Italian cities like Siena were united in their common worship and festivals in which the families, kin groups, and neighborhoods all had their place. The festivals of the city's patron saints and of the Blessed Virgin are important even today in Italy. I was once walking through Palermo and I didn't realize this parade went on for an hour. So in ancient Athens, the Pan-Athenaic Festival, which is depicted so beautifully and movingly on the Parthenon frieze, was the most important event in the Athenian calendar. Significantly, if you follow the sequence of sculptures from beginning to end, walk around it in the museum, it's like watching a film that shows the preparation, the procession, the celebration. Most tellingly, we find seated calmly above the fray and above the hubbub, the great gods of Athens who are there taking part in the celebration. Although there was literally no such thing as a city-state in American history, many cities did in their early days possess many of the same chartered rights enjoyed by English and European burghs or boroughs. But in the decades following the American Revolution, the states began to revoke the pre-revolutionary charters, and they rechartered municipalities as creatures of the states, which led exactly to the court ruling that Don Livingston has mentioned over 100 years later. In the end, the cities were made creatures of the state, just as the states were made creatures of the federal government. But interestingly, Charleston, until maybe the 1930s and 40s, even after it had taken down its walls, Charleston retained many of the qualities of the Greek polis or the Athenian city-state. America did retain for a long time a normative ideal of a city on a human scale, an urban center plus surrounding countryside, whose residents typically enjoy citizenship within the city. This is the opposite of the malignant megalopolis that has spread like cancer across the country, devouring neighborhoods and cities in a terrifying swath of destruction and ugliness from Boston to Richmond. This, then, is the human norm of creativity, a city made up of autonomous neighborhoods and serving as the economic and political center of an extended region with its own identity, its own cultural and religious traditions. The size, the scale of the Commonwealth is not the primary issue here. The great empires that actually worked, the Roman Empire, for example, and the Holy Roman Empires, were in fact confederations of city-states that devolved all real power down to the local level. That's why they worked, that's why they survived. Modern states in Europe and North America have chosen the opposite course, and we live today with the horrifying consequences. The only solution that I see lies in the restoring by one means or another of these little communities. And just to tie it up a little with something that was said earlier, Vince brought up Jericho, one of the oldest, perhaps the most ancient city. Originally, the archaeologists and anthropologists thought that these early cities grew up as intersections of trade routes. In fact, they grew up before there was international trade or trade between cities. What we find at the beginning of every ancient city, of the oldest type, is a temple. It was gathered together, and by the way, that's true of Native American settlements in the United States. They were gathered together, these urban aggregations gathered together as sacred spots. 100 years ago, T.S. Eliot asked us in a poem, "Do you huddle together because you love each other? What will you answer? We will dwell together to make money from each other." Eliot's answer was, there is no life that is not in community, and no community not lived in praise of God. And I'm afraid that until we learn some of these very ancient lessons, there's really no hope for rebuilding our community. Thank you. I've taken too much time already.
Thank you, Tom.
Greetings. Always nice to come last because then I can go till 5 o'clock. So the reason I'm here, I'd like to thank him for it, is I met Tom, Vince, and Geoff 6 years ago, and I was writing a book called Skin in the Game. And I stole a sentence from them that became viral. which is, at the state level, I am a libertarian. Sorry, at the federal level, I am libertarian. At the state level, I am a Republican. At the county level, I am Democrat. And with family and friends, I'm a communist. Okay, so in other words, that's the idea to explain scaling. So, and what am I here talking about scaling? So, my specialty is volatility. Okay, so I'm a statistician. I was a trader for a long time, volatility trader. So, how things withstand volatility. You know, the definition of volatility, we can talk about it with a drink because there's no clear definition of volatility. But so, and scale and volatility, how things that have volatility and shocks and errors are handled differently at different scales. So scale matters. For example, and another specialty, subspecialty I have is I call it BS busting. Is you take a statement and then put some, what I call some mathematical rigor on it, and then realize they're not the same. For example, and then one advantage of small towns, very simply, is that the scaling works as follows. If meeting someone 1,000 times is functionally different from meeting 1,000 people once. Okay, so 2 comments I'm going to add to this and then continue with what I was planning to talk about, mainly the difference between elephant and mouse. The first one is, I don't know if you're around or if you've heard of it, but about 1200 BC, we're not quite sure, there was the Bronze Age collapse. And who was running the show then at the United Nations, who was voting at the United Nations at the time? You had the Akkadians, you had the Hattusa, and then you had the Egyptians. These were the big guns. They would sit down at the United Nations and then veto or something. They were running the world. So what happened to these 3 big states? They collapsed. Okay. Egypt was, the invaders came, and it's like, they went through Egypt like a hot knife and butter, right? So these collapsed suddenly. Now, what came after the Bronze Age collapse? We had big centralized states. And you know this big, large city, Babylon for the Akkadians, and then later Nineveh. The Hattusa had, of course, the center, which has disappeared now. And then, of course, Egypt had one big center. Not even more than one big center and a summer resort. So what happens after that? Your story, okay? The Phoenicians and the Greeks, and given that I'm both Phoenician and Greek, so it is, I like the idea, ran the world at the time because they ran the Mediterranean. And what were they? They had nothing centralized. The Greeks would centralize, now we know from records, but we don't know about the Phoenicians because the records were destroyed. They centralized for games. That's it, okay, supposedly, right? Or maybe for music. So here we see the value of the small state running the world. They were the Singapores at the time. They had the less resources, like Phoenicians had absolutely no resources. The fewer resources you have, the more you have to learn how to trade, and the richer you got. So pretty much they had settlements around Asia Minor and the Mediterranean. With a myth, people think that these were Greek settlements in Asia Minor. Now we know more and more that the Greeks, like the Phoenician, were the same Anatolian stock dispersed around, the East Mediterranean. Anyway, so that's one story to confirm. And you're talking about Italy. We wrote, so I did a few papers on statistics of violence showing why people have the illusion that they conflate frequency of wars with risk of wars, with intensity of wars, okay? And the example we gave, and one day there was a historian, I was at a meeting where we have all these empty suits that they're trying to recreate the Congress of Vienna, by all these hotshots, think tank thinkers, deans of international relations stuff. And I gave my talk telling them that Italy, shocking them that Italy, because we did statistics of violence to just show that it's what was in connection with my black swan idea that's dominated by fat tails. Italy, before unification, which happens around the mid 19th century, had a lot of wars. Not hundreds, thousands of wars. How many people died? A maximum of 35,000. Then they unified and they had peace. And these people in the room kept claiming, yes, it's a lot more stable. The unification of Italy was much more stable. How many people died in the First World War in Italy? 680,000. That's one more. Just to tell you that what the nation states do is they create this false stability. But I'd rather have a little bit of volatility in the system that ends up stabilizing it. Okay, so that's one example, one illustration of why, and all these empty suits were convinced that it was more stable because they had fewer wars. You know how the wars were run in Italy? Sometimes mercenaries on both sides would go in and shake hands and do a deal, and often they would switch sides in the middle of the battle. It was, I mean, they had a lot of wars, these city-states. And anyway, and another example, one day I was arguing for decentralization, and the Prime Minister of Greece was there, took my defense. Everybody was attacking me. He said, if Greece were like Italy, decentralized, we wouldn't have a military coup. Because Italy, had it been centralized like Greece, with everything that artificially recreated city Athens, they would have had, a military coup in Italy. Anyway, so now technically, since I, commented on stuff, very simply, what my business is about. My business is about understanding nonlinearities and reactions. So let's take a very simple example. If I jump 10 meters, it's a lot worse than if I jump 10 times 1 meter. You agree? So 10 meters, you have a funeral. There's a Greek Orthodox cemetery here, so I'm an Orthodox, so it's very convenient. 10 times 1 meter, nothing happens. You smash a car against a wall at 100 miles per hour, a lot more than 100 times the damage if you smashed it at 1,000 times at 1/10 of a mile per hour, right? So that nonlinearity is necessary for fragility. Okay? And one simple, I'm not going to go through the math in a few minutes, but I'm going to give you a simple example. A mouse and an elephant, they look about the same. If an elephant falls from this table, guess what? Bye-bye. Breaks a leg, it's gone. Now, don't commit animal abuse or anything, but let's say that, so it's a thought experiment. If you throw a mouse from the top of a building, guess what? It will laugh at you. So, and now think about it in these terms. Same thing as the Bronze Age collapse. And the next Bronze Age collapse, which we'll experience with the collapse of China and Russia, all right? Not the US. Think about how many elephants are there in the world. You know the mammoth? It's only recently that it went out of business. There were some when the Great Pyramid was built. Okay, so there are not that many elephants. Okay, under 100,000 or something, that order of magnitude. Now, how many mice do we have? Just in New York City, you have in New York City they claim and nobody counted them. Plus, they don't vote, so you don't need a census. They're like more mice than inhabitants in New York City. Okay, so you realize that you have, as you get bigger, you have what I call pseudo economies of scale. An elephant is vastly more metabolically efficient than a mouse, but they don't survive shocks. So it's the same thing for large corporations, by the way. The key to survival is medium size. There's a sweet spot. So to continue, visibly, that effectively works in favor of some scale. But what is the optimal scale? Well, it depends on what business you're in. If you're making airplanes, you need a large company. But if you're a restaurant, I don't know any restaurant that has more than 100 tables that can still deliver in a sustainable way real food. Okay, after it goes into junk food very quickly or into touristy things. So that's what I work on. is so nonlinearity. There's always the presence of nonlinearity. And to finish to talk about, someone was talking about tinkering is as mode of exploration, because tinkering is a lot of noise. You make a lot of mistakes. You have a lot of noise, but small mistakes. Small mistakes are qualitatively different from large mistakes. Jumping 1 meter actually strengthens my bones. 10 meters, as I said, there's very nice, actually. It's very quiet around the cemetery, right? So, and people have fear that conflate the two. They have fear of volatility, when effectively, volatility is good for you. The best predictor of the bankruptcy of a company is what? Or a hedge fund. It's no volatility. Because you don't adapt. It means you're not adapting to noise. It means you have some business for a corporation from some head of state who knows someone. So you have a steady business from some large customer, and the person, I don't know, has brain cancer, or that's what happens to bureaucrats, and because they don't think too much, so they develop diseases, and the bureaucrat dies, and guess what? You lose your business. So if you look at it empirically, it's a predictor. Surviving, in spite of having high volatility, is a predictor of success for a company. And effectively, my main chapter in Anti-Fragile, the book thanks to which I met the Grahams, is on the main difference between a cat and a washing machine. That everything organic not only likes volatility, but needs it to survive. So I don't know if you have washing machines, but my experience of if I hit the washing machine, it doesn't improve. Okay, but maybe my wrist may improve. Okay, so everything that is built can't handle volatility, like things that are organic that require volatility to function. If I don't go to the gym, what would happen to my muscle mass? See, I'd look like, I don't know, some bureaucrat again. I mean, so it's like the whole thing. If you don't subject your body to stressors, it wastes, because your body communicates with the environment via stressors, just like corporations, just like. So when you see political noise, like in Switzerland, you have a lot of political noise. They improve via problems. And the problems are on the surface, and they appear to be very visible. And this is the problem of America, is that we have too much information, so we see a lot of problems. This country is the healthiest country probably on the planet, second healthiest after Switzerland on the planet. So and we really communicate. It's not my brain that dictates. I have a Mediterranean complexion, so I get darker in the sun and lighter, in the shade. How? Well, my skin gets a message from the stressor. I get burned next time, so I code for more protection. You see, so that's how systems adapt to environments via noise. And when they're very large, they don't adapt via noise. Something large and centralized will experience a Bronze Age collapse again. The Soviet Union collapsed. Hopefully, Russia will collapse soon. It's too central. 12 time zones with you have to curate a history, nationality, language, all of that. And the same applies even more to China. China had a collapse with the Ming Dynasty when they had their success and then they centralized. Okay, thanks. That's what I had to say.
Thank you all. I want to ask one question of all of you, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone here. When I was early in my building career, I would collect quotes and memorize them, and one of the ones that just would really inspire me, I feel differently about today than I did almost 30 years ago. The quote, Daniel Burnham, probably all the architects here can recite it. It is, I won't do the whole thing, but it's essentially, make no little plans, they have no magic, disturb men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high in hope and work. And he goes on and on and on. I used to think that was the coolest quote in the world. Now I kind of hate that quote. And I think it's caused more problems than solutions it has brought. And so I'm wondering, my question is just, can you react to that? Like, where's an example where I might be wrong? I'm probably asking the wrong audience here.
There's one thing about being locked into the plan. So like not having optionality in a plan. Let's take the symmetry that you have in having a mortgage. Okay, when you have a 30-year-old mortgage, you have the option of paying it back to the bank, which is why banks always lose money, because they don't sell you that option at a good enough a price. So having a plan, there's nothing wrong with it, provided you have a way to change, to exit without cost from the plan. But what the problem of planning is that people get on a big highway that has no exit. So that's what the big problem. And the second one, to give you some empiricism on why it's wrong to have big plans. A friend of mine, when I did my convexity argument, nonlinearity argument, a friend bent something, foreign, Fluberg, a very smart man, sent me data on cost overruns in UK. So if they have £5 million projects, pound now is lower. So the £5 million projects, they don't have a lot of overruns. £100 million projects, they have huge overruns. And then he looks also at Olympic Games, and then of course more and more overruns, and cost overruns and time to completion increases non-linearly with the ticket. Well, then he looked at the thing and he said, yeah, effectively they can't adapt. So if you break it up in small blocks, you wouldn't have that problem. And hence, when they do highways in UK by small blocks, okay, it's a lot better than one large.
I think we have to focus on what he actually said, which is the power to stir men's minds, not the power to get things done or get things done well, which is totally different. Early on in my career, when I worked in inner cities, I actually knew enough to limit what was being proposed to reasonable things. Tinker here, adjust there, and so forth. And I remember after one charrette presentation, somebody came up to me and said, "Where's the fountain?" And what he meant is like, where's the bling? Where's the excitement, etc.? And I do think that I have cynically experienced both the limited realistic plan and the ambitious, this is the best town center south of Atlanta take. And the big plan really does have the power to stir men's minds, which is independent of all the other things that planning should be doing. Again, such as being realistic or being a good plan. But well, look at Zaha Hadid. You know, look at all these people that are actually the star architects of the world. You know, the fellow who did the 75-mile city in Saudi Arabia. You know, like we can't get enough of it. You know, the great 25-story, double-sided, 75-mile city. I mean, finally, the sheikh said, "Finally, I have a plan that I can get behind." You see? While all the new urbanists who've all had our chance with the sheikhs of Arabia, do reasonable plans that are actually good for the people, and they die. So yes, I think we need everything in our repertoire, frankly.
Years ago, I read an article by a philosophy professor, I think he was, or government professor at the University of South Carolina. He was a Yugoslav named Vukan Kuic. And it was interesting. What he said was, political theory is inherently tyrannical because the political theorist redesigns the world the way he wants to. So whether you're Plato or Thomas More, big theory will always mean big government and big tyranny. In the 18th century, they called these plans projects, and they called the people who designed them projectors. And if you want to read a really prophetic book, one of the most prophetic books ever written and completely misunderstood in the 20th century because they made a cartoon movie of it, read Gulliver's Travels again. Read the third book in which he goes to Laputa, where it's projectors. They've got schemes for, making sunbeams out of cucumbers. They've got, every crazed scientific and social, sexual project you could imagine Jonathan Swift puts it in there, and we all laugh, except we're living in the world of Swift's worst nightmare. So big planning means some bright person thinks he could plan your life better for you. And I'm not talking about something, because obviously, if you're planning a community or planning a house, that's one thing, and where, a certain amount of system is obviously necessary. But if you're talking about planning a city, or you're planning a new life for a country, John Dewey planned to use education to create a new democratic man, and we're living with the consequences. So big planners, big projectors, big political theorists always have their plans at the expense of human freedom.
Always? I mean, are there any, what are the counterexamples? Surely there are some.
Yes, Hayek or von Mises. I mean, when I fight with libertarian, because the thing is, of course, I'm a classic liberal. I like small government and stuff like that. But it comes a point where there's things you need the government for. And I always cite either Hayek, who wanted the government to intervene to stop deforestation, to intervene for international security, Hayek, and pandemics. He used the word epidemics. And von Mises, who said, the government is not evil. It's not even a necessary evil, all right? It is needed, okay, to stop coercion. It is needed for some function. I just want the government outside the business of business. That's sort of like what he said. So in other words, you still need, the problem with centralized government is a problem with the EU, all right? Subsidiarity is a great concept that the Romans applied, the Catholic Church applied successfully, but then came the EU. It works very well if you're a country like Bulgaria and you want to, become like Sweden, or at least get closer. It works very well. But the problem with these, when you put bureaucrats, 200,000 in a town like Brussels with excellent food, but bad weather. So what happens? They got a lot of free time, and not much commuting time. So they got a lot of free time to start messing with your life, like the size of your vacuum cleaner, the energy cost of your toaster oven, and they can't guard the borders. So what you want the reverse. You want a good government, okay? You want a government to guard the borders, all right? Not one that deals with vacuum cleaners. But the problem with execution is that effectively you're going to have bureaucrats. It's not the government. It's these people who are in a situation to start running and meddling with your life, who will meddle with your life on things that are not large scale. So what I call tail risk is a job of the government. So, but you need the government for that. And I keep citing the real libertarians. I mean, von Mises is not it's not Karl Marx.
Far from being an anarchist or even a libertarian, government is government considered as a natural outgrowth of, for example, what communities always do. If you put everybody in this room, if all of a sudden everybody else died in the United States, and here we are in the Ion community, well, we're going to have to farm, we're going to have to fish, we would form a commonwealth of some sort very quickly, and we would find means of dealing with our problems. An ancient Greek in a polis, he never had the thought, those guys in government are out to get me. Because there was no us and them, even if it was a king. The point is, we all belong to this extended family through our kinfolk and through these subsidial organizations of kinfolks. We're all in this together. We might have a bad ruler or a good ruler or a bad government, but but with modern states, it's me against the people in Washington, and I think that's inevitably because of, for example, the growth of bureaucracy.
Yeah, no, but it's not a building environment.
Of course not.
You had problems with when you had the rule of the 30. You have episodes in classical Greece that were not.
But even in the rule of 30, afterwards, they passed a law saying nobody could be prosecuted for being a friend of the 30. And Aristotle comments.
Yeah, but they still killed Socrates for that.
Well,
they prosecuted
Socrates.
That was
one of the charges. But Aristotle comments on this. He says, it's amazing. The coherence of the Athenians. They refused to persecute each other except during a crisis. No, it's not.
There's a Marxist philosopher, a serious man called Paul Lafargue, who wrote the book called The Right to be Lazy. And he was, and it sounds like a joke, but it was a serious book. When he died and was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, his funeral was attended by all the stars of Marxism. This was before 1918. And he says the Marxist theory have all wrong. They want to actually compete with capitalism in production. And he says, actually, the reward should not be those who produce the most, because that means then you have to get a lot of people to buy the things, or they're rewarded with material. It says the reward of Marxism should be leisure. Okay? Your assignment, everybody should get the most reasonably small assignment that's necessary for survival, and then the sooner that they stop, that they're finished, then they can actually do their real pursuits of Marxism, which is to read, to write poetry, to do whatever they want, to go fishing. But it says the reward is to not go into overproduction, and in fact, the problem that we have now is reward people with leisure, do less. And this sounds kind of weird, but when I was in New Orleans, I wanted my car washed once a week, and the guy said, no, I'm already washing 6 cars a week, and that's enough, I get by. And I was so shocked. I said, but your charge is $35, that's a good chunk of change. And he says, no, I'm doing 6 cars a week, and that's all I need. And he was happy. And I think one of the things that's one of the problems with suburban sprawl, is how much time everything consumes to get anything done. How actually the labor movement that have reduced our day to 8 hours, right? Whole century-long battle, we only work 8 hours. Now, because commuting, we have a 10-hour day. They've actually wasted that free time between home and work and home, which is where actually the French, for example, Parisians, most enjoy their life. You know, it's that hour of freedom between work and the duties at home. And one of the worst things about suburbia is how it allocates. You have to pick up your child, you have to be a soccer mom. Everything is double and triple and quadruple the amount of time. And to actually grant people the leisure to enjoy what they really want would be one of the greatest gifts. And that's Paul Lafargue, by the way, incredible writer, and forgotten. He's trouble, because neither the Marxists nor the capitalists want anybody to hear about this.
Well, I'm a big fan of being lazy, so I need to do that. My dad will tell you.
Can I make a comment about a remark that Vince gave me? One quick remark. When I sat with Vince, when I first met you guys, 5 years ago, 5 or more, we were sitting in a cafe, and we spoke about people's preferences. Like, if you ask people what you want, oh, I want a big house on 50 acres and this and 2 horses and 5 cows, whatever. That's what they think they want. But in fact, Vince was telling me the closer they are to the neighbor, the more they pay up. And effectively, the friend, I reported this to a friend of mine, Rory Sutherland, who just, has a wonderful book where people don't quite understand what they want. And effectively, they did a market study to try to replace Coca-Cola. And they asked people, what do you want? I want something, I want a bigger bottle. That was okay. I want it to be cheaper. And I want it to taste better. That was the market. He's a vice chairperson at Ogilvy, and they did that. Well, it turned out that what replaced Coca-Cola, the only thing got close to taking market share away from Coca-Cola, came in small bottles, was more expensive, and in those market studies, people were going out of the way to explain how undrinkable it was, and many compared it to urine or something. And you know what it was? Red Bull. So people really don't know their preferences. And it's the same thing if you ask people what kind of restaurant you'd like. They tell you a restaurant with nice waiters, distance between tables, and no line. But if you want to make a lot of money in a restaurant, you make it half the size, cram people together, make it noisy, and create an artificial line, and that's where it'll show up. So people don't know what they want. So they don't vote with their words. So this is where bureaucrats, that's my idea behind skin in the game. They don't have skin in the game. So they don't know what you want. If you don't know what you want.
Till age 65 so they can have leisure. He just arrived at that conclusion when he was 25. You know, that he wanted his leisure now to do what he wanted. He wanted to cook and party and tell stories. So what's the currency? What are you being paid in, leisure or funds? And I think that's really a fundamental decision in your life. And I think a lot of people actually decide, well, right now there's something called the young people apparently are, what is it called, quiet vacationing or quiet quitting. There's a bunch of young people that are actually, they go to their jobs, but they certainly work much less than the prior generation in the time that they put in. They're quiet quitting. They're less ambitious about accumulation and more ambitious about free time and private life.
I think I found a counterexample to my rule. Take Venice. I mean, think about the historical precedents of a country that stayed prosperous for a very long time, didn't have a cycle. Venice as a republic stayed as a city-state, a republic, millennium. So and it was not till these assholes invaded, and then they incorporated in that state of Italy, right? That because when you had the Austrians, you had these guys, they knew how to work, but then came Napoleon, who destabilized the world, and then of course that happened. And then you had that Italian unification where they threw in Venice with Italy.
The economic shift also toward the Atlantic, away from the Mediterranean, cost them a great deal, and the rise of Ottoman power. The Venetians were very ambivalent. They didn't in the last help the Byzantine Empire survive, and then they collaborated. But it wasn't enough. With Columbus, it changed the game. The economic game.
Wealth was in exactly the wealthy. There was along the Silk Road connection, Silk Road Mediterranean. So that was the old route. So while they moved to Byzantium, which was a small little town, became Constantinople because it was closer to where the money was. You always follow the money. After initially they tried Carthage, but then what was Columbus? Then the North Atlantic became rich, and you guys came into play.
Yeah.
North Atlantic, that's it.
So we'll have one more question from Bob, and okay. We have two more questions. We're doing two more questions. We're going to start with Bob. They don't vote
because
up.
they make $80,000 a year, all right, and they want to convince you because. So this is. I mean, I think that it may be true, but anything written in a psychology journal has more than 50% chance of being wrong.
It's a little like these polls of what's the best places to live, and it always say in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was always Massachusetts, et cetera, and Alabama and Mississippi were always at the bottom. Then you ask the people, and turned out the people who said that they were the best off lived in Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and the people who said they were the most miserable were people in the affluent Northeast. So you got to wonder.
Nolan, please.
I was going to toss out a grenade, so in the interest of 30 minutes of break, I'll just raise it at supper. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's very generous of you. Everyone, we have drinks and food set up here. Thank you very much to our panelists. Appreciate you being here.